When Jim McKean asked me to do this many months ago, I think it was way back maybe in the spring, even the winter, but when they were planning this meeting, I said, sure, I'll be glad to talk about the future of antimicrobials. And then a couple weeks later, I started thinking, what am I going to really say about this topic? You know, while I represent the industry, I really have never worked for a company in the development, discovery and development of these products. But I hearken back to something Lonnie King said yesterday, or the day before, I guess it was, that he's not an expert in the area, but he's been around a long time. And that's certainly my case. I've been around a long time, so I've seen a lot through my experience in veterinary practice, with the government, and now with the industry. So in approaching this topic, my focus will primarily be on kind of the regulatory environment for going forward with antimicrobial development, but obviously there is a component here of discovery and development of new products. There's also public perception of what's happening, and so I'll try to touch on some of those areas and maybe talk a little bit about some alternatives, which would be a good segue to our speakers following me. Before I start, I'd like to give some thanks to Tom Shryock of Elanco, who's here in the audience, and Chris Zook of Pfizer, who's helped me prepare this presentation, sent me some information and some slides that I've borrowed liberally from their presentations. So my overview today will be talking a little bit about the development and approval process, not too extensively, but I just want to kind of give people a feeling for what we're talking about, some time and cost of market data that we've recently collected, and then I'd like to get into the regulatory environment with antimicrobials, in particular with older products, existing approvals that are on the market, what FDA is doing with those, and how they're handling new products that come to them. And then get into a little bit about market factors influencing the development of new products, and then conclude with just a brief comment about some alternate technologies that we heard briefly about yesterday, and then some of my personal conclusions. So this is a fairly simplified chart, and what it does is provide an overview of the discovery and approval process all the way through the end and even after approval. As I said, it's very simplified, but it kind of gives you a thumbnail sketch of what we're talking about. Certainly in the scientific discovery area, it's very difficult to find new compounds that are successful. And this quote of 1 in 20,000 discoveries are successful, I think really came from human drug development. You know, most of veterinary products have come from human discovery efforts because it's extremely expensive to do that discovery work, and generally the animal health companies have not had the resource to do it, so they've relied on their human counterparts. So if a discovery is successful, it'll then go through preliminary trials, which are in vitro bacterial tests and chemical screens. If it survives that, it might go into some preclinical trials, which are generally laboratory animal, acute chronic studies, dose ranging studies, and if it gets that far, it then goes into full-blown clinical trials with the target animal or humans, in the case of human drugs. In this case, it goes into controlled field studies in animals. If it's a food animal, residue studies, and other aspects of food safety, which I'll cover in a minute. And then, of course, the regulatory review occurs through the FDA CVM. The product is approved and uniquely published in the Federal Register. It's the only FDA-approved product that actually is published in the Federal Register as a regulation. It's kind of a unique thing with animal drugs. And then monitoring goes on with adverse reactions, basically looked at after the product is approved. But then there's also the NARMS component with antimicrobial resistance. So there's other monitoring that goes on beyond adverse reactions with antimicrobials. On the left-hand column, you'll see an estimate of 7 to 10 years and about $100 million. We have some updated information on that, but that's a pretty close estimate. We've had that estimate for a number of years, and recent data has kind of backed it up. The FDA approval process, specifically with antimicrobials and other animal drugs, involves safety, efficacy, and quality. Quality, of course, is how well the product is manufactured. With regard to safety, there are several components to the safety evaluation. It has to be safe to the animal, has to be safe to the environment, and FDA conducts an environmental assessment of some sort, maybe more extensive depending on the concern, and human food safety with food animals is a major component. Now, with all animal drugs, Residues are clearly a concern, residues in food, and so FDA spends a lot of time reviewing the toxicology of a compound, the withdrawal times, residue depletion data, and sets of withdrawal time and MRL, maximum residue limit, or tolerance as they call it in food. However, with antimicrobials, there's some additional requirements. One is impact of the residue in the food, possible impact of the residue in the food on human gut flora. I think that was mentioned yesterday. That's a relatively new requirement. It's been in place in FDA for at least 10 years. It's really been in place internationally for a number of years. It's not a resistance issue. It's really the impact of what those residues might do on the natural gut flora of the human. And then we have guidance for Industry 152, which we also heard about yesterday, and that is to determine the potential for resistance selection to impact human health through food. So those two parts of the review process are unique to antimicrobials, and I think Dr. Sybil said yesterday that the process is more complicated for animal drugs than it is for humans, and I can fully agree with that. And I think that shows you some of the added complications to get a human or to get an animal antibiotic approved. Talking about time and cost of marketing, I showed you that estimate of 7 to 10 years and $100 million. Well, we actually did, IFA is our International Federation for Animal Health. They're the global organization that represents the global animal health industry in Brussels. We are a member of IFA, and every 5 years they do what's called a benchmarking survey on the competitiveness of the animal health industry. And they go out and survey all their member companies, many of which are our member companies, and ask them questions about what are the drivers for success, what are some of the obstacles to innovation. And one of the things we did in this particular survey, which just came out in 2011, was ask our companies, on average, how long does it take you to get products approved through the regulatory process, and what are the general costs for getting those approved. This chart shows you, along the top line, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, GMO products requiring NEPA, which is Environmental Impact Assessment, master seed biologicals, and new combination biologicals. I won't focus too much on those other products. Just for reference, you can see those. But the pharmaceuticals, as you see over on the left-hand column, FAP is food animal product. The mean for a food animal product is about 9.4 years. That's from initial submission of the investigational file to FDA to final approval. The range, as you can see, is anywhere from 7 to 13 years. So it's a fairly lengthy process. That 13 years are probably for more controversial products. Below that, companion animal product is about 6.4 years on average. Minor species is about 6. So that gives you some idea of how long it takes a company to get through the FDA regulatory process. With regard to costs of approval, the same survey looked at that, asked companies how much it might cost to get a product approved. On average, a new pharmaceutical product, API is active pharmaceutical ingredient, so that would be a new API, costs on average about 38.8, 40 million, but there's quite a range, 20 to 100. Most companies would tell you that 100, if you're doing beef cattle, you're probably pushing a lot closer to that 100 million and even beyond 100 million. With chickens, it's a little cheaper because chickens are cheaper to test, so you might be down closer to that 20. But in any case, that kind of gives you an average of what it costs to get a product on the market. A fairly lengthy process and costly. Let me talk a little bit about the regulatory history. Of course, we all know that this issue has been debated for probably 40 years. It's hard to believe that it's been going on that long, but it really has since the late 1960s, early 70s. And we all know that there's been mountains of literature produced on this, on many concerns. Whether those concerns are real or perceived, you could probably fill this room with the amount of literature that's come out on antimicrobial resistance. Of course, regulatory policy, because of all this, has been shaped over the years, and it's led to a relatively restrictive regulatory environment. Guidance 152 is one example of that. A little bit of timeline information. 1988, FDA has declared that all new antibiotics must be approved as prescription drugs. Prior to that, antibiotics were generally approved as over-the-counter, and that's got a long legislative history. Back in 1968, Congress decided that animal drugs should be allowed to be marketed over-the-counter as long as adequate directions for use could be written. And that was due to a number of reasons, because there was lack of veterinary coverage in a lot of the rural areas of the country, and also that it was just generally assumed that the producer owned the animals, and so they should be able to do what they want with their own animals. In any case, that changed in 1988 when FDA said, no, antibiotics really need to be under prescription. Because of that, in 1995, a special provision of that veterinary supervision, the VFD, was passed, and that specifically applied to antimicrobials used in feed. Because feed products could not be handled as prescription drugs easily because of pharmacy acts, they passed a specific provision called the Veterinary Feed Directive. Well, this was a prescription-like process, but it only applied to antimicrobials in feed, and it led to the approval of the initial VFD product, tilmycosin. So in 1995, that law came into effect. In 1996, of course, we heard yesterday that from Pat McDermott that NARMS was implemented to track resistance. In 97, FDA publishes their first no extra label drug use list. So these were drugs that they said you cannot use extra labelly, and that list included a number of antimicrobials, including fluoroquinolones. In 2003, Guidance 152, qualitative risk assessment, as FDA termed it, came out, and that was a requirement that all new antimicrobials go through. In 2008, we heard again yesterday that GFI 209 came out, and this was the FDA policy statement to phase out antimicrobial growth promotion use and move all medically important antimicrobials to the VFD process. And then in 2011, cephalosporins were added to the extra label drug use restrictions, and a lot of the people in the room have worked on that one and know all about that. And then in 2012, just recently, GFI 213 came out, which describes to companies how to phase out those growth promotion claims and move to VFD, and also, if they can, as Harry said yesterday, Harry Sneelson, that they could substitute those growth promotion claims for therapeutic indications if they could support them. And then also at the same time, the VFD regulation changes were proposed. So there's been a long history of FDA regulation over antimicrobials, and I always have to laugh when I read reports that say FDA's done nothing about antimicrobials. Well, that's not true. They've actually done a lot. If you look at the history of this, they have slowly cranked down on the regulations and restrictions on antimicrobials, and it's just, going more that way. The current uses of antibiotics in animals, we all know about disease treatment, disease control, disease prevention, and performance. The first three of those claims are all considered therapeutic. The last one, performance or growth promotion, would be considered non-therapeutic. Another way of looking at this is those three indications sort of off to the side. Therapeutic uses considered by AVMA, FDA, and Codex, disease treatment, control, and prevention. The definitions are there that came from the CLSI, and then the growth or health maintenance. Now, in the future, what do we expect to happen? Well, we expect to have disease treatment, disease control, and disease prevention, therapeutic indications. However, for growth promotion uses, they will be only limited to non-medically important antimicrobials as defined by FDA. So that's likely what's going to happen in the future, is those claims will go away for non-medically important antimicrobials. With regard to that, FDA with older products will phase out AGP uses on medically important antibiotics probably over the next 3 to 5 years, depending on how quickly they move on their regulatory timelines. Those medically important antimicrobials, penicillins, tetracyclines, macrolides, lincosamides, streptogramins, and potentiated sulfas. A little bit shorter list than what's seen in the PAMTA legislation that Harry talked about yesterday, that Louise Slaughter has sponsored. Also with regard to those medically important products, the marketing status will change from over-the-counter to Veterinary Feed Directive for all those products that have a medically important antibiotic in them. Now, the interesting thing is FDA is unique in the world. A lot of drugs are used in combination in feed, as we know. FDA approves all those combinations as discrete new animal drug applications, and they have discrete labels attached to those. So the problem is going to come about is that a medically important antibiotic in combination with other non-medically important antibiotics or non-antibiotic drugs will still have to carry that VFD label. Well, there are over 200 new animal drug applications approved with a medically important antimicrobial in it. So as you can see, there is going to be a massive change that's going to need to take place. FDA is concerned about that, and they're trying to find a way to minimize that impact. But there's a huge impact that could happen on medicated feed manufacturers, producers, and veterinarians. So that's something that's going to take a long time to get put in place. The other thing I would speculate on, and this is speculation, there are other forms of medically important antimicrobials out there. There are injectables, there are boluses and tablets, there are oral drinking water solutions, intermammary infusions with some of these drugs that are over the counter. The current VFD or the current 209, 213 guidelines don't cover those. They only cover feed and water applications to some extent. So I expect that after FDA gets done with handling feeds and putting those under VFD, they will also take those medically important antibiotics that are given by prescription or other dosage forms and put those under RX, under prescription labels. So a lot of those products that are now available in feed stores like oxytetracycline and Tylan down the road probably won't be available over the counter any longer. It will require a veterinary prescription. Again, that's speculation. FDA hasn't proposed that yet, but I suspect that is coming down the road. If they're going to make medically important antibiotics VFD and feed, they pretty much have to do that for the injectable forms as well. At least I think that's what they're going to be thinking about. Talking about new products, all new antibiotics that have been approved in recent time have been approved for short duration and either prescription or VFD. There have been new formulations of existing products that have been developed because there haven't been a lot of new compounds out there. There have been no products approved for herd and flock administration. There have been 2 products that have been withdrawn by the FDA, and those were the fluoroquinolones in poultry. There's also 1 product, the cephalosporin, that was rejected by the FDA Advisory Committee, even though CVM recommended approval. That was cefquinone. We don't know the status of that product, whether FDA is going to make a decision to approve that or not. And then, again, I mentioned before, there are 2 classes that are restricted for extra-label drug use, fluoroquinolones and cephalosporins. I put this chart up here because I just went back and took a look at the new antibiotics approved in the last 15 years. The reason I picked 15 years is about 2003, I think, is when FDA implemented their new guidance 152. So I thought I'd take a look at the history of drug approvals since that. There's some interesting observations, I think, on here. As you can see, most of these products are injectable. Most of them are for individual single dosing or short-term dosing. They're virtually all for very targeted indications. Bovine respiratory disease, swine respiratory disease. There's a couple of other indications in there, but they're pretty focused, targeted indications. A couple of water medications in there and maybe 1 feed. And also, you'll notice that macrolides have been, in the recent history, have been developed and have been pretty popular. I think Dr. Sybil said that yesterday. So I think what this is showing you is that there's very targeted, very specific, limited indications that FDA are approving, all under prescription use. I mentioned down here that those 2 products for chickens were withdrawn in 1995 and 1996. The thing that sticks out with me is there aren't any approvals for avian species in here at all. The 2 that were approved for avian species were withdrawn. Since then, if there is development going on, it certainly hasn't come out yet. So I think the avian market is probably concerned a bit about the lack of new products. What is the impact of GFI 152? Well, it's portrayed as a qualitative risk assessment, but in reality, it's all about risk management. The 3 components of that is they look at release of antimicrobial resistant pathogens from the animal, exposure in the food, and the consequence important to human health. This all adds up to an overall risk of high, medium, or low. And I say it's risk management because FDA assumes there's a risk. They just have to categorize how high a risk they think it is. And frankly, if it's critically important to human medicine, that pretty much drives the categorization. It's going to be a high-risk product. And this is the risk management chart they use once they decide whether it's high, low, or medium. And they put it into these categories. And basically what this tells you is that if a product is considered a medium to high risk to human health, it's going to be pretty much restricted the same way. It's going to have a prescription label or a VFD label. It's going to have probably extra label use restrictions. The extent of use is going to be very limited, targeted to specific classes of animals or small groups of animals, limited treatment. PAMP means NARMS. It's going to probably be included in the NARMS program for monitoring and may or may not go through an advisory committee. So it's fairly restrictive the way they're going to handle those. And really, there hasn't been any Category 3 products approved. So virtually everything that's come out now has been in the Category 1 and 2, very limited, targeted use indications. What are some likely candidates for future development? Well, I think we know that there's a concern about human health, so certainly non-human uses or unique analogs are going to be preferred to minimize cross-resistance. Lack of genetically encoded resistance mechanisms would also seem to be preferred. Certainly, it's all going to be prescription or VFD. You're not going to see any antibiotic come out over the counter, at least highly unlikely that that would happen. I shouldn't say never, but it's unlikely that that's going to occur. And administration, as I said, very focused, individual injection to individual animals, less than 6 days, selected pens or groups, targeted treatment, limited dosing. I put this chart up here because I thought I'd take a look at, kind of put in perspective what we're talking about with regard to availability of animal drugs. This is a pie chart that I borrowed from one of our companies that was doing a presentation. This is the FDA animal antibiotic sales data they collected in 2010. Since 2008, they were requiring companies to submit sales data to them, and this is their latest report. The thing that sticks out in this pie chart is those two big wedges, tetracyclines and ionophores. That amounts to 72% of the total. So that's really where most of your drug use is going in animals. There's other classes of drugs. As you can see, there's a fairly big category of NIR, which is not independently reported. Those are compounds that may be a single company compound that FDA cannot report because of confidentiality reasons. It includes a number of like fluoroquinolones, but also a number of drugs that aren't used in human medicine. So if we take away the ionophores, which are not used in human medicine, we have this much left. So there's a fairly large percentage, 30% of the antibiotics used in animals are not used in human medicine. And the media seems to always forget this when they're starting to when they quote numbers out there, even though we've tried very hard to educate them on it. And if you take away the drugs that are only important to human medicine, not critically important, you're left with what's considered critically important to human medicine. That's a very small category. You have a tiny wedge there, you can barely see it, of cephalosporins. You have fluoroquinolones, which are buried in the NIR category. They're not independently reported. I'm not sure how much of that, but it's small. And then you have a little bit bigger wedge of the macrolides. And then one trimethoprim sulfa. So those are your critically important antibiotics in human medicine. Hardly used in veterinary medicine at all, but those are the classes that veterinary medicine would probably need to draw from for new products, but also are going to be reluctant to draw from because of the human health consequences. So I just point this out to show you that there's not a lot of room to go with new compounds. If you're going to get into products that are marketed for human medicine, you're going to have to hit those categories. What's not in this chart are carbapenems, linezolid, colistin, daptomycin, some of the newer products in human medicine, and you probably won't see those coming through in veterinary medicine. Future development. We really need to look at the future development of antimicrobial agents in the perspective of world food production needs. This came up yesterday. Global food demands in 2030 are estimated to increase substantially with an increase in livestock and poultry production. The development of novel anti-infectives will need to be developed that meet both health, animal health, food safety, and human health. The challenge in all this lies whether the regulatory agencies are going to cooperate with this, whether they're going to see these as mutually exclusive objectives, or they're going to start to apply some risk-benefit to it. Because if it's a risk-only equation, we're not going to get very far. As I said, FDA is fundamentally changing how existing antimicrobials are used in feed. Manufacturers are going to be very selective about what they research. Public acceptance is going to be a factor in future development plans. And frankly, worldwide regulatory policies, particularly those in Europe, have a big impact on our companies and on other agencies as far as developing new products. We've developed a host of species guidelines on extra-label use, on judicious use, responsible use, clinical practice guidelines. These are certain themes that will dominate, I think, the development of antimicrobials in the future. To avoid cross-resistance, we want to use narrow-spectrum classes. They're going to be more preferable. Co-resistance and cross-resistance, to minimize those, we're probably going to look at bactericidal mechanisms away from bacteriostatic, and appropriate label directions will probably get more extensive to guide the user on reducing the selection of resistance. So probably be a lot more pharmacokinetic information on the labels. The parenteral route would be preferred when possible. When injectables aren't acceptable, there'll be other medications that are given to small groups of animals, and regulatory acceptance will really be important for microbial food safety risk evaluations. Some risk management strategies companies will engage in. They'll probably like to hold new products in reserve in expectation they'll not be overused and subsequently lose their effectiveness. Formularies might be developed to direct veterinarians on which products to avoid based on human health importance. That actually has been going on now. Some of the AVMA judicious use guidelines do have a type of formulary approach. And the need for antimicrobial suscepting and testing methods will become even more important so that veterinarians can be assured they're using the right product and not leading to some not leading to some resistance problems. Diagnostic methods for clinical disease will become more important, and recommendations ensuring oversight of feed antibiotic use by veterinarians. So this is all going to be a much more restricted environment. There's going to be a lot more pressure on veterinarians and pharmaceutical companies to develop products that aren't going to lead to potential problems or perceived problems in human medicine. What does an ideal antimicrobial product look like? Fundamental quality, safety, and effectiveness, sufficient to meet regulatory requirements. Patent protection is very important. Companies invest a lot of money, as I showed you before, in developing these products. They have to have a way of being able to get that return on investment. If they can't and they're subject to generic competition, they're simply not going to invest that amount of money. And they have to also have a way of differentiating their product from existing products. You know, there's a lot of antibiotics out there for BRD and SRD, and I know all the companies are jockeying to find a market advantage for their product. It's going to be very important because to a lot of producers, they all look the same. It's not a member of the critically important antibiotic list, preferably. It's not used to treat Salmonellosis and Campylobacter. I mentioned this before. Bactericidal mechanism would be preferred over bacteriostatic, and a rapid metabolism to non-microbiologically active components. Now, these are the components of an ideal antibiotic. Are we going to get these with antibiotics? Unlikely we're going to meet all these criteria, but that would be the ideal, those ideal criteria given what a company might look at. Let me spend, I have about couple of minutes, right, Tony? Yeah. Okay. I just spent very quickly on some alternative technologies, and these are some slides that I borrowed from Chris Zook of Pfizer. In 1980s, fluoroquinolones, third-gen cephs, and fluoroquinolones were approved. In the 1990s, we had fourth-generation cephalosporins and novel macrolides. In the 2000s, the human health and animal health targets have pretty much diverged. Human health programs have focused on MRSA, multi-drug-resistant pneumococci, multi-resistant tuberculosis, whereas animal health programs have moved more towards livestock, respiratory disease, enteric disease, and skin and soft tissue and UTIs in companion animals. So there's been a divergence of the way the development has gone in human and animal health. And this has severely limited the ability of animal health companies to leverage substrate from the human market. Traditional substrate, novel classes, where can we go? Well, we can look at discarded products from the human health programs. There's always a risk that those products might come back into use in human medicine, but that's one area we can examine. We can explore older generations of existing products, classes, and manipulate the molecule. This is very expensive to do. It's a possibility of manipulating a molecule to meet some of the criteria I've given you. And we always have to give consideration to what is critically important in human antimicrobials, and colistin might be one of those. Alternative targets and substrate. Just briefly, and I think Cyril Gay and the speaker after him will probably talk a lot more about this. Just two examples of alternatives: large molecule substrates, peptides, antibodies, phage license, bacteriophages, which are bacterial viruses. So these are sometimes referred to as alternatives. They're not classic small molecule antibiotics. They're novel anti-infectives. Antimicrobial peptides are not peptide antibiotics, but they are proteins that are produced naturally in neutrophils and epithelial cells. These could be synthesized to have a specific impact on bacteria, pathogenic bacteria. The advantage of these is that it can be specific to the bacteria and not affect the host. Bacteriophage therapies, we heard a little bit about this yesterday. This might be, I think somebody termed it maybe rocket science, but it might be something that will be focused on very specific indications like Pseudomonas aeruginosa. One of the things about bacteriophage therapy is they think combinations of phage are going to be more effective than individual phage therapy. Just touch on a couple of examples of alternatives that might be coming down the road to replace typical small molecule products. So my conclusions. The future's now. Why do I say that? Is because I think what we're seeing now with the regulatory arena we'll be seeing in the near future. There's a clear regulatory roadmap for traditional antimicrobials. There certainly will be more restrictions on current approvals, as we see with VFD and 213. There is limited development of new antimicrobials, particularly medically important. Companies are very reluctant to get into that medically important category for obvious reasons. Fewer new applications in feed, water, and prevention. I mean, you're probably not going to see a preventative use. We had a control use approved a few years ago, but that's, I think, the last true control application we've seen. Increasing cost and time for development. I don't think those numbers are not going to go down. And I personally think, and some of my avian friends in the office, in the audience will agree that we probably need to focus some development on new avian antibiotic products. I think that's a market that's been really missing. And newer technologies will be important as greater restrictions on conventional antibiotics are enforced. Finally, we do need to develop new anti-infectives that meet the needs of both animal health and food safety because we have a growing population. We shouldn't really exclude any molecule or any substrate that can be effectively exploited for animal health as long as it does meet animal health and food safety requirements. The regulatory pathway for some of these alternative agents, we like to talk about them, but frankly, it's going to be the same as for traditional agents. So we can expect a long process, if not longer, than it takes to get a new a traditional molecule on the market. The fact remains today, even though alternatives sound like a good idea, there are really no viable alternatives to therapeutic antibiotics for disease treatment. Hopefully that'll change in the future, but that isn't the case today.